Hollywood has sold you a lie. The charismatic pirate with a pearly white smile, a dashing adventurer full of energy. This is a facade. Now let's zoom in on the real face of a 17th century sea marauder. Instead of a smile, you'd see black, swollen gums oozing blood and pus. His teeth are loose in their sockets, ready to fall out at the slightest touch. His skin is covered in scurvy sores, and his gaze is dull. His breath is an acrid mix of rotting flesh and dried blood, a smell you could sense from several feet away. The main question isn't why they looked this way. It's how we could have ignored this biological catastrophe for so long. We will uncover the system that guaranteed the transformation of healthy men into walking corpses. But first, two paradoxes that defy all logic of survival at sea. The first, why did pirates, who plundered ships carrying the best provisions, meat, and rum, suffer from scurvy and die from vitamin deficiencies more often than merchant sailors with their meager rations of hardtack and water? The answer awaits you in the 5th section. And the second paradox, how could Blackbeard's flagship contain a complex urethral syringe for treating venereal diseases when the surgeon's main tool for any serious injury was a common carpenter's saw? We will unravel this mystery in the climax, in the 8th section. This investigation will change your perception forever. We will systematically break down the arsenal of 7 elements of pirate reality, from diet to parasites. After this, you will never be able to watch pirate movies the same way again. Instead of admiring their freedom, you'll feel a phantom toothache. Instead of the romance of the open sea, you'll smell the nauseating stench of bilge water and filth. You will understand why Blackbeard's true curse wasn't sea magic, but simple microbiology, and why his most fearsome enemy was invisible to the naked eye. In just 3 minutes, you'll learn why pirate treasures were a myth, and in 10 minutes, we'll reconstruct the authentic smell of a pirate ship. Stay with us. How could a ship, where anarchy meant death, lack the very code of honor we know from films? The answer is simple. It existed. Only these weren't moral statutes, but rigid legal contracts, ship's articles, regulating the division of plunder. But here's what the sources hide. These articles provoked violence. The punishment for stealing a sip of fresh water was disproportionately cruel, as the daily ration often didn't exceed half a liter. Most pirates were fugitives from the Navy, and their code reflected not honor but primal fear. But the most famous torture, walking the plank, has almost nothing to do with them. Why is this vivid image, which became a symbol of pirate cruelty, almost never found in ships' logs or interrogation records? Because from a pirate's perspective, it was senseless theatrics. It was far easier to just throw someone overboard. The real punishments were more horrifying. For example, marooning a man on a deserted island with a pistol and a single pint of water. Or keel hauling, dragging a person under the ship's keel. Imagine a human body as a soft vegetable, and the barnacle-encrusted hull as a coarse grater. But the most terrible torture on the ship required no participation from the crew. It happened every day in the filthiest place on board. This brings us to the third myth, treasure. Why did pirates almost never bury treasure? Where did all those immense riches actually go? They were spent. A pirate ship was an enterprise with huge operating costs, repairs, gunpowder, bribes to port authorities. At sea, a chest of gold doubloons was useless. The real treasure, the kind worth killing for, was a barrel of fresh water, a crate of lemons, or medical supplies. Over half of all sailor deaths in the 18th century were caused not by battles, but by disease, because their floating home was designed to kill them long before they could spend their loot. So the code is a deception, walking the plank is a fiction, and buried treasure is a myth. If all of this is a lie, what was their real life filled with? We have cleared the stage of Hollywood tinsel to see the pirates' true enemies, filth, hunger, and disease. Their ship was not a symbol of freedom, but an overcrowded floating prison from which there was no escape. It wasn't freedom, it was a death trap. And to understand the depth of their suffering, we must begin with the most disgusting aspect of their existence. A place they don't make movies about. The ship's toilet. And what you are about to learn will change your idea of sea romance forever. How could the toilet, the head, located on the open bow of the ship, be one of the deadliest places on board. It would seem that the fresh wind and waves solve all problems, but records show dozens of sailors were simply washed overboard during storms. Its design was deceptively simple, a graded platform over the water. All waste fell directly into the ocean, a brilliant system of self-disposal. But in a storm, this system worked in reverse. The head turned into an exposed breakwater. Waves not only washed men away, but they also forcefully threw feces back onto the deck, the anchors, and the ropes. It was a double trap. Drown, or be covered in someone else's excrement, which the crew then tracked all over the vessel. But what was washed from the head was only the visible part of the problem. Where did the tons of waste from a crew of 150 men go? Food scraps, the contents of chamber pots? The answer seems obvious. Everything was thrown overboard. The ocean would hide it. But in a calm or in a closed bay, the ship would stop. But the garbage wouldn't. Every week, the crew produced over a ton of biological waste. That's the weight of an adult rhinoceros. The ship literally drifted in a foul soup of its own filth, which clung to the hull and rotted. This floating layer of grime not only exuded an unbearable stench, but also attracted schools of sharks, turning any fall overboard into a death sentence. However, the main source of infection was not outside, but on the lowest deck, in the stinking darkness of the bilge. What is bilge water, and why did this phrase alone evoke superstitious dread among 18th century sailors? It's an unavoidable mix of seawater seepage, rainwater, and any liquids that drain to the bottom of a wooden ship, a technical feature of its construction. But this water was contaminated with rotting cargo remnants, rat droppings, and vomit. Over months, it turned into a thick, black sludge emitting hydrogen sulfide. Pumping it out with hand pumps was one of the most disgusting jobs on board. The smell of the bilge, an acrid mix of rotten eggs and swamp, permeated the wood, the clothing, and even the food. For the ship, bilge water was what septic shock is to the body, an internal poison. And this poison soaked not only the planks, but also the skin of every person on board. What would you choose to survive on such a ship? A bar of soap or an extra liter of fresh water? Soap was a luxury, and fresh water was valued more than gold and used only for drinking. Washing in salt water didn't remove grease and only irritated the skin. The average sailor had no more than 2 sets of clothes. They weren't washed for months. They became saturated with sweat and pus, turning into a perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas, and literally rotted on the body. Scratching the bites led to non-healing, infected sores. The lack of hygiene wasn't a sign of savagery, but a consequence of a hostile environment. Pirates were trapped in a cycle of filth. But even if they had an endless supply of soap and fresh water, it wouldn't have saved them, because the main enemy entered their bodies through their mouths. How was the staple food that could be stored for years? Hardtack. Both a salvation from hunger and a daily source of disgust. The technology was brilliantly simple. Flour and water, baked to the hardness of a rock. It didn't mold, which made it ideal for damp holds. But not spoiling was an illusion. The flour was often infested with weevil eggs even before baking. In the warmth and moisture of the hold, the eggs hatched into larvae. The hardtack transformed into a living, teeming ecosystem. Sailors developed a ritual: eat the biscuits in the dark, or tap them on the table to shake out at least some of the insects. This was commonplace, but weevils in the bread were merely an annoyance. The real toxic threat lurked in the barrels of meat. Why was salt beef, nicknamed salt horse, meat preserved in salt, considered so dangerous? After all, salt is a preservative. Chunks of beef were layered with salt and packed tightly into barrels. This was the only way to preserve meat on a voyage lasting months, but it was often spoiled even before being salted. The salt was dirty and unrefined. The barrels could leak. As a result, the meat continued to decompose, turning gray-green, as hard as wood and poisonous. It was soaked in water for hours, but this didn't save it from the putrid taste. Sailors described that even after this, the salt beef was so hard it could be whittled with a knife like wood. But what they washed it all down with was even worse. How was rum, the main symbol of pirate freedom and fun, actually an instrument of slow suicide? Its utility was obvious. Fresh water in barrels quickly went foul and became a breeding ground for dysentery. Adding rum to it, creating grog, killed some of the microbes and masked the disgusting taste. It was a necessary sanitary measure, but constant alcohol consumption led to chronic dehydration. The standard daily ration in the British Navy was half a pint, about 280 milliliters of strong liquor. This weakened the body and made it vulnerable to infections. A diet of living biscuits, rotten meat, and alcohol instead of water was literally devoid of vitamins. It was this rich pirate diet that opened the gates for a killer more fearsome than any storm. Pirates didn't die of starvation in the literal sense, but what exactly happened to a person's body after months on such a diet? It received calories, but was deprived of key micronutrients. The immune system was suppressed by the constant battle with toxins from food and water. This diet created perfect laboratory-like conditions for the development of total avitaminosis. The body began to consume itself, but it happened slowly, masquerading as ordinary fatigue and joint pain. Now we will see how this invisible starvation progresses to a visible, horrifying stage, how it turns strong, hardened men into living corpses whose bodies literally fall apart. We will talk about scurvy. The number is shocking. About 2 million sailors. That's how many scurvy killed in the 18th century. This is more than all naval battles and shipwrecks combined. At first glance, the cause is simple: an acute lack of vitamin C. No vitamin, you get sick. But this simple fact hides a terrifying biochemical mechanism. Without ascorbic acid, your body stops producing collagen. This is the protein that acts as the glue for all your tissues. Imagine a brick wall from which the mortar is slowly being washed away. At first, nothing is noticeable, but then the entire structure crumbles to dust. Your body literally begins to disintegrate. A sailor would attribute weakness and joint pain to hard work. He didn't yet know that his body had already begun the process of self-destruction, and the first battlefield where this would manifest in all its glory was his own mouth. What did a person whose body was being consumed by scurvy actually feel? First, the gums would swell, turning a purple hue and bleed at the slightest touch. Then they would begin to rot, spreading a cadaverous stench, and grow so much that they completely covered the teeth. Teeth would become loose and fall out from the softened jawbone. Any meal, even softened biscuits, became torture. Spontaneous hemorrhages or hemorrhoids would begin under the skin, turning the legs into one solid black bruise. Surgeons of the time described how long-healed bone fractures would separate again, and old scars would reopen as if the wound had just been inflicted. The body forgot how to repair itself. It is in this state that the full horror of their dietary paradox becomes clear. This brings us back to the question: why did pirates, who plundered ships with the best provisions, meat, and rum, suffer from scurvy more often than merchant sailors? The answer is that their better food was their death sentence: salt beef, hardtack, cheese, and alcohol. This diet contained 0 milligrams of vitamin C. They could eat their fill, but their bodies were starving at a cellular level. While Navy ships sometimes included sauerkraut or onions in the diet, pirates scorned them. They considered meat and rum to be real food, and vegetables as food for the weak. Their freedom of choice was their curse. They voluntarily chose a diet that killed them. But scurvy was not the only invisible killer on board. Now, imagine this man. He can barely move, his gums are bleeding, and his skin is covered in sores. His immune system is virtually non-functional. A body afflicted by scurvy was like a fortress whose walls had crumbled. Any enemy could enter without the slightest resistance. He is an open wound, a perfect breeding ground for any infection. And now that the body's defenses are broken, new predators enter the scene. They are much smaller than a man, but they number in the millions, and they are carriers of even faster and more deadly diseases. It's time to talk about the invisible crew members: lice, fleas, and rats. How could it be that a tiny body louse posed a greater threat to a battle-hardened pirate than an enemy cutlass? The constant debilitating itch, scratching until bleeding, and festering sores were commonplace. The single change of clothes, which they called walking cloth, was worn for months on end. But here is what the sources hide. Body lice are the main carriers of typhus. In crowded conditions, Ship fever could incapacitate up to half the crew in a matter of weeks. The only way to get rid of the parasites was to boil the clothing, which was impossible given the scarcity of fresh water. Every pirate was trapped on a floating incubator with his own personal carrier of death. But lice were not the only bloodsuckers feasting on the sailors' bodies. How could legions of fleas, capable of causing an epidemic, appear on a ship isolated in the open sea? They were passengers on the ship's main stowaways, black rats, which boarded the vessel in ports along with provisions. The picture changes when we descend into the hold. Rotting food scraps and constant dampness were a perfect incubator for rats. Their population grew exponentially. Hundreds of rats meant thousands of fleas, which, in the crowded conditions, easily jumped onto the men sleeping huddled together, and rat fleas are the primary vector for bubonic plague. The hold was not just a storeroom, but a reservoir of plague. This brings us to the complex and grim relationship pirates had with the main hosts of this feast, the ship's rats. What were these relationships really like? Rats were an absolute evil. They destroyed the meager supplies of food and water, gnawed through barrels and sails, and chewed through ropes. It was an all-out war for resources. However, reality was more cynical. When supplies ran low and famine set in, rats transformed from pests into prey, eating a roasted rat to avoid starving to death today, while simultaneously accepting the risk of contracting leptospirosis from it, which would kill you tomorrow. It was a choice between two forms of death. All these sources of decay, rot, filth, disease, parasites, merged into a single suffocating symphony. We have examined them as separate threats, but how did they interact? In reality, it was a single food chain of decay. Rotting provisions fed the rats. The growth of the rat population increased the flea population, and the crowded, unhygienic conditions allowed lice and fleas to spread freely among the men. A pirate ship was not just a vehicle, but a living, hostile organism. An ecosystem perfectly designed for the breeding and spread of disease. And this system had its physical manifestation, a monstrous, all-pervading smell. In the next chapter, we will conduct an autopsy of this smell, breaking it down to its molecules. What comprised the basic human smell on a ship where 100 men were confined in an enclosed space for months? We think of the simple smell of sweat, but the reality was more complex. Sweat, mixed with salt from hard labor in the tropics, was just the background. Layered on top was the smell of never-washed and rotting damp clothes. To this was added the sour reek of constant grog consumption. But the most terrifying component was the smell of the diseases themselves. The sweetish, cadaverous stench from the mouth with scurvy, caused by decaying gums, and the acrid odor of dysentery. This was not the smell of uncleanliness. It was the smell of a body literally falling apart while still alive. But even this human stench was only the top layer. Beneath it lay the smell of the ship itself. What did the wood of the ship smell like? We imagine salted wood, resin, tarred ropes. This is the smell of adventure, the Hollywood version. But ship's logs shatter this picture. Reports from British Navy captains often mention that the first sign of an approaching pirate vessel was not its flag, but a monstrous stench carried by the wind for hundreds of yards. The reason is simple. The ship's wooden hull, like a sponge, absorbed everything. Salt water, leaks from barrels of rotting food, human waste, and hydrogen sulfide from the bilge. It was the smell of mold, fungus, and slow decay. The ship didn't smell of life. It smelled of death. And in this all-pervading stench, one sharp chemical odor was ever present, the smell of desperate medicine. We've broken down the smell of the bodies and the ship. Which was the most psychologically unbearable? The smell of rot, a reminder of hunger? Or the smell of a sick comrade, heralding one's own demise? Perhaps the most terrifying smell was one originally associated with the ship's life, the smell of tar. It was used to caulk the hull to protect it from water, but red-hot tar was also used to cauterize stumps after amputations to stop the bleeding. This sharp chemical smell became a trigger for pirates. It meant not repairs, but screams of agony, the smell of burnt flesh, and the high probability of a comrade's death from shock. This smell led directly to the epicenter of pain. What does this sensory torture tell us about the life of a pirate? It wasn't just a collection of smells. It was their very reality, turned into air. They were trapped in a space where there was no escape from the monstrous stench. The food rotted. The ship's wood rotted. Their bodies rotted while they were alive. The stench was the physical embodiment of this total decay, a constant, second-by-second reminder of it. Pirates lived and breathed the air of death, and when the body in this hell of filth and stench finally gave out, they had one last, most terrifying hope: the ship's surgeon and his saw. What would make a pirate willingly lie on a table and allow his arm or leg to be sawn off without anesthesia? The answer is gangrene. A bone shattered by a cannonball or a deep cutlass wound that began to turn black and rot. Amputation was the only way to stop the slow, agonizing spread of death through the body. But here is the stark reality. The ship's surgeon was often illiterate. He might be the cook, like John Haskins from the ship Wida, whose knowledge of anatomy was limited to gutting fish, or a carpenter, who simply knew how to handle a saw. His decision was based not on medicine, but on primal terror. Cut off the rotting part to save the whole. The patient's choice was between the terrible and the monstrous, certain death from blood poisoning in a few days, or unbearable agony on the table with a slim chance of survival. This brings us back to the paradox from the beginning. What was a complex urethral syringe doing in the medical chest on Blackbeard's flagship? Next to it lay amputation tools. A saw identical to a carpenter's, knives, and hooks. They were not sterilized. At best, they were wiped with a dirty cloth. The only anesthesia was a large swig of rum and a leather gag to prevent the patient from biting off his tongue in pain. 4 strong sailors were needed not to assist, but to hold down the man writhing in agony. And here's the culmination. The syringe was for injecting mercury into the urethra. This was considered a treatment for syphilis. They were willing to inject poison directly into their bodies in a desperate attempt to defeat an invisible enemy. The tools are ready. The patient is held down. The surgeon picks up the knife. The procedure consisted of 3 stages of hell. First, a quick, circular incision through the skin and muscle down to the bone. Speed was the only form of mercy. But then, the real nightmare began. The second stage, the saw. Imagine the sound of a saw grating against your living bone. Screams that even the gag couldn't muffle. Blood flooding the deck. And the third, final stage. After the limb is severed, the bleeding must be stopped. The wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron, or as we know, hot tar. The pain from cauterization was so monstrous that it often killed on the spot from shock. The entire procedure took 3 to 5 minutes of pure agony. But even if a pirate survived this hell, his main battle was yet to come. What were his chances? What killed those who managed to survive the saw and the red-hot tar? The main enemy awaited the patient after the operation. Post-operative infection in the conditions of a floating cesspool was guaranteed. Dirty instruments, dirty hands, dirty air. The open wound became a gateway for sepsis. The mortality rate after amputations in the 18th century Navy reached 80%. Most died not on the table, but within 2 weeks. Pirate medicine wasn't treatment. It was a gamble with death, where the surgeon was the dealer. We have seen all the circles of this hell, from diet to parasites, from filth to the surgeon's saw. Now it's time to put it all together and understand the true curse of the pirates. We have connected the individual elements, but how did a diet of weevils and rot and an army of invisible parasites work together to create a perfect storm? It was a deadly feedback loop. A diet devoid of vitamin C led directly to scurvy, causing tissue breakdown. Scurvy and constant alcohol consumption completely destroyed the immune system. A pirate's immune system, due to scurvy, became like a sieve. Any threat, no matter how small, a bacterium or a virus, passed through it without resistance. This defenseless body was then assaulted by infections carried by lice and fleas. It was a system where the diet prepared the body for death, and the parasites delivered the final blow. A pirate died not from one thing, but from a total system collapse. But this internal loop of destruction was amplified by an external one. How did the pirates' environment predetermine the outcome of any injury and any treatment? Their ship was a totally contaminated environment. The concentration of bacteria in the bilge water of a pirate ship was hundreds of times higher than in the sewage of London at that time. It was a concentrated broth of disease. In such conditions, any scratch became immediately infected, and an amputation, even if the surgeon did everything correctly, doomed the patient to death from sepsis. Their all-pervading stench was not just an inconvenience. It was a sensory reminder that their environment was killing them. The ship was not a sanctuary, but the main ally of their invisible enemies, the microbes. We promised to help you understand why a pirate's life was so short. The answer lies in their freedom. At the very beginning, we asked a question. Why did pirates, symbols of freedom and strength, actually live in a hell of disease? The answer is simple. Their freedom itself was killing them. Unlike the Navy, which had iron, albeit brutal, discipline, deck scrubbing, and regulated rations, chaos reigned on a pirate ship. This freedom from order was also freedom from microbes, filth, and disease. Their democracy did not extend to the laws of epidemiology. The freedom to choose their food led to scurvy. The freedom from sanitary standards turned the ship into a sewer. The freedom from professional medicine led to the carpenter's saw. Their main enemy was not the tyranny of captains, but the tyranny of entropy. They were the freest, and at the same time, the sickest men on the ocean. Their true curse was not a black spot, but a microscopic bacterium. And the most terrifying monster lived not in the depths of the sea, but in their blood. We have traveled the entire path from romantic myth to disgusting reality. And now, the main question for you. Who was the pirates' real ultimate enemy? On one hand, external order. The Royal Navy, which hunted them, hanged them from the yardarms, and represented the force of law and empire. On the other hand, internal chaos. The microbe, which devoured them from within, using their own freedom as a weapon. We ask you to summarize this investigation with us. Write just one word in the comments below this video. Fleet or microbe. No explanations, just your choice. Let's see which one gets more votes. And the next time you see Jack Sparrow in a movie, remember that his real adversary wasn't Davy Jones, but E. coli. Thanks for watching.